And now it's time to get story-ended. He's a National Book Award nominated author and illustrator of books for children. His latest is a very personal graphic novel about growing up in a family grappling with addiction. Hey Kiddo details his experience. I sat down with him recently to talk about his life, the important new book, and great stories, and also what it's like to be nominated for the National Book Award. Here's my exclusive interview with Jarrett Krosoczka. Jarrett, I've got to start with kind of the wide angle here. This is your 38th book.
Number 38, yes.
Did you always want to be a storyteller?
I always wanted to be a storyteller. I always loved to draw. As a kid, I did. And it wasn't until I was an adult when I looked back at all the drawings I had made. All of those drawings were made to tell stories, stories via comics or short little stories with words and pictures together.
But this is really the first time that you, and this was a long time coming, Hey Kiddo. It really is such a heartfelt memoir in many ways of those early years. Why did you decide, first of all, this is not for every reader, it's not for your normal audience of very young readers, it's 12 and up.
Yes.
Why was now the time to tell this story? And why did you decide to tell it in the voice of the 17-year-old Jarrett?
Sure. I love coming-of-age stories. That moment in a young person's life when they are deciding who they want to become and what they want to do with their lives. And it's not that, you know, when you ask why now, it's more the question of like, you know, why did it take you so long? Because I've been working on it for several years. I've been thinking about it.
You wanted to do this in your early 20s.
I did, and every time I sat down to write the book, I would stop and sort of censor myself because I would fear what people would think on how I was representing what happened. And I realized pretty quickly that if I wanted to write this book, a story about my upbringing, it needed to be authentic. And if I wasn't emotionally ready for the consequences of putting this book out in the world, I shouldn't write it.
Your editor, I read in an interview, your editor, when he got the first manuscript of this, said, "You're dodging the heart of this story."
I was dodging.
What were you dodging?
Well, you know, by the time I finally gained the courage to write this book, my mother wasn't in the first draft much at all. And my editor, David Levithan, pointed that out. And he's also, not only is my editor,
a good friend of yours,
and a good friend of mine and a very talented author, and he said, "You're avoiding writing about your mother." You know, and so I gave him several scenes and went digging. And the thing about writing about your own life, I mean, we have our memories,
right?
And they exist in the deepest parts of our brains. But then you might talk to a relative and you might remember something. I also activated all of my various senses to trigger memory. So, you know, your sense of smell is the most powerful sense to
take you back
memory. So I went out and bought my grandmother's perfume and my grandfather's aftershave.
Wow.
And even the sense of touch. So I went on eBay and bought some of the old toys that I had had. So and there's a moment in the story where I'm very young and I'm given a tan Tonka truck. And so I looked up online to see what it looked like, but I wanted to remember what it felt like. So I ordered it. And you know, this is not like the trucks. My kid has a truck made of locally sourced recycled plastic. Right. Right. This was made of lead paint and steel. And it just you know, your sense of hearing. So I had a playlist of music my grandparents would listen to, that I listened to when I was young, and activating all of those senses helped me dig deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Well, it's such a personal and difficult portrait at times. Your mother was addicted to opium use. When did you know that she was an addict? How early did you know?
I was in fourth grade, and so my grandparents took me in just before I turned 3. So now there I was, I probably had just turned 10 years old, and they sat me down and they said, "Well, we think it's time that you know the truth as to why you're here."
And this scene is in the book.
And that scene is in the book, and I have a very strong memories of that event because it was traumatic, and traumatic events tend to stay with us very vividly. And he sat me down on the couch and just told me straight, you know, she's addicted to drugs, and she's been incarcerated, and that's why you haven't seen her. And so every now and then, you know, maybe I would visit her in a halfway home. My grandfather never took me to see her in prison. He didn't want me to see that aspect.
And she was in and out of prison throughout.
She was in and out of prison. She was in and out of halfway homes and recovery places. And so that was difficult to take in, especially growing up in the 1980s where there was this one public service announcement that really stuck out to me. And most people who grew up in the 80s remember this, where the father comes into the teenager's room and he's found a box of drugs. And he says to the kid, "Who taught you how to use this stuff?" And very famously, the boy says, "You." "All right, I learned it by watching you." And then the narrator comes on and says, "Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs." Now, as an adult, I'm thinking, why were they playing that during Saturday morning cartoons?
Right, why are they telling us that?
They should have just playing that during the evening news
Right.
when the parents were watching it.
Right.
And so I was so fearful that, oh no, am I doomed
I'm
to
gonna be
follow
a drug addict.
that same
Oh,
suit? Am
wow.
I going to be a drug addict as well? And so my mother, while she was incarcerated, she would write me letters, but she would also, more importantly, draw me pictures. She would draw a cartoon of, say, Snoopy, and then I would write her back and I would draw her a picture of Garfield. So we traded these drawings back and forth. So, at fourth, fifth, sixth grade, I'm seeing how talented she is.
Wow.
And that I was, given that same talent, and she was never able to do anything with it. So I was determined at a very young age to, you know what, I'm going all in. This is what I want to do, full stop.
Wow. Do you believe, you surely do, that the roots of your talent, your drawing ability, came from your mother?
Oh, it came from my mother, which in turn came from my grandfather, her dad, the grandfather who raised Joe. Yeah.
Tell me about Joe and Cheryl. Now, they are in the middle of this the trauma of having a parent who is opioid addicted and addicted to drugs and in and out of prison. You have this amazing story that you've captured of Joe and Cheryl, your grandparents. And I can imagine, from traveling around the country as you do and talking to kids in schools, this is not a unique situation in today's America. Tell me about them and what it's taught you telling their story and that interaction of the younger generation and their grandparents.
So growing up, they always shared stories about what it was like growing up in the Great Depression, what it was like to get ice for a literal icebox, how hard they worked, and my grandfather, how he started his first job. And so the chapter 1 opens with the two of them meeting in high school. Because I realized to tell my story, I needed to tell my mother's story. To tell my mother's story, I needed to tell her parents' story. And so I was able to pull these stories that they had told me over the years and put them down in print and have them there to share with people. His hard work, his service in the Navy during World War II. They were very salty characters. They cursed like a truck driver who used to be a sailor. They smoked 2 packs a day each, non-filters.
Wow.
And it was constantly, there's constantly cigarette. When you're writing children's books, make sure everyone's wearing a helmet.
Right.
Everyone's wearing a seatbelt.
No cigarettes.
And
no cursing.
No cursing. And to write this book authentically, grandparents don't have seatbelts.
Yeah.
There's not enough cigarettes.
There's booze.
There's booze.
There's booze in the evening.
Because they were never labeled as alcoholics.
Right.
But by the time I was in 4th, 5th grade, I could order their drinks. Southern Comfort Manhattan Dry with a twist, rocks on the side. So the ice on the side, so that glass could be as full as possible. And they would have 2 or 3 of those at dinner when we were out, for dinner on a Friday night.
Wow.
Yeah. But the thing is though, my mother and my grandparents, as crazy as life was, I was loved.
Yeah.
I had unconditional
love. And
love.
that shines through in this narrative.
I'm
and
so happy
I
to hear
love that. The brokenness, the reason this works, and you know this, and the audience, I think, knows it when they encounter truth. It's unfiltered, like their cigarettes. It's unfiltered.
Yeah.
And people know he's presenting these people in all their flaws, and their love inevitably breaks through.
Yeah.
And that's what struck me. I know these people. They didn't live in Worcester. They were in New Orleans. But it's the same people, the same understanding, the same life choices, and at times difficult lives that they fought. And to carry that affection for you, which they took to the very end. I want to ask this question. It's a curious choice for an author to open a book with his grandfather teaching him to drive in a cemetery.
Yes, well, again, it's truth. That's where I was taught how to drive. So,
but why that open? Why in a cemetery? Why start the book?
Why start the book in a cemetery?
Well, of death.
One, it's as sort of dark as a cemetery can be, it also offers a moment of levity because it's an everyday thing that my grandfather is teaching us to drive teaching me and all of his kids to drive in a cemetery because everybody's already dead. And that was his humor. He had a dark sense of humor. When he talked about where he and his wife, my grandmother, were going to be buried someday, he's like, put me on the corner so like I could sneak out at night and she won't know I'm gone. You know, and so because I'm talking about family history. He would always stop by and see his parents' grave. So I was able to make a connection with my great-grandparents and where they are and were, you know. And I wanted to cement, so you said, why? You also asked earlier, why did I tell this story from a 17-year-old perspective? Right. Because I need to be on the side of my reader. And my reader is the teenager for this book. While I was working on this book, I also was writing a picture book. It's called Naptastrophe, inspired by my daughter, Lucy, who doesn't like to nap. And if she doesn't nap, as you know, a toddler has a naptastrophe. And the first draft was all about why naps are important. And this is what you have to take a nap because it's terrible if you don't. And I thought, you know what? I'm not on the side of the parent. I'm on the side of the reader here. I'm on the side of that 4-year-old. And for the 4-year-old, naps take you out of your day. You know, you're not playing with your toys. So I had to be there for that 17-year-old kid. And so I wanted to cement this story is being told by the 17-year-old. And then we go all the way back to the early 1940s. My grandparents meet in high school. He leaves for the service. They start their family. And my grandmother starts drinking very heavily. And then you see where things are going to go haywire with my mother. And I wanted to give my mother, I wanted readers to have empathy from my mother. I didn't want it to be, because life isn't black and white. Life is varying shades of gray, and it's a sliding scale of complicated for everybody. And when we see people on the streets, you know, perhaps they're homeless, perhaps they're strung out, and it might be really easy to just label them a junkie, but that's somebody's kid. That's might be somebody's parent. Right. Could be somebody's sibling. They're somebody's family. So before you see Leslie go really dark down this path with her heroin addiction, you see her as a sad kid. Yeah. You see her as a lost teenager.
The chapter dealing with the early part of your childhood, you call it not life with mother, but life with Leslie.
Life with Leslie, yeah.
Why that distance?
There was a time in my life when, and you know, the majority of my teen and adult life, where I would call her Leslie. You know, because the moniker of mom, I felt belonged to my grandmother because she had raised me. Also, it's alliterative, you know, two words start with the same sound. Life with Leslie makes
it's pretty.
But that is something where my editor David pointed out to me that he and I were talking on the phone about that first draft. And he said, "You barely talk about your mother." And I replied, I guess passive aggressively, yes, I didn't write about Leslie all that much. And he picked that up to say, okay, that told me a lot. Your reply there told me a lot.
And that got you to go back and go deeper.
Go deeper and find more stories to share.
I want to go back to one quick thing. That eternal perspective, to my eye, when I read the book, that eternal perspective, that sense that your grandparents, because of where they were in life, and the cemetery being, you know, they know that's, my father always goes, you know, I went by my retirement home today. You know, when he goes to the cemetery. That sense of eternity's coming and eternity's with us. How did that color your childhood, and how does it affect your work today, and this work in particular?
Yeah, when you're being raised by your grandparents, I mean, I can understand as a parent, you want nothing more but for your children to grow up to be adjusted adults who can take care of themselves when you are no longer able to take care of them. Now, I can only imagine for my grandparents now, they're in their 60s taking care of this young child. They just have a sense that their time they're closer to death than they are to birth, for sure. So anytime my grandmother would take a photo, she'd say, if that comes out good, put it in the paper. You know, so that way her friends could see a flattering photo of her.
I love it whenever you quote them.
Oh,
you always put the cigarette. You always put the cig in your mouth. I have a friend who I always do because I always see them with a cigarette. Tell me about you have your grandfather kneeling by his parents' grave at the beginning of the book. There is this, at times, saucy sense of faith where they're, you know, throwing out the expletives. At other times, there's a sense of faith lingering around these scenes. How much did that figure in the life of your grandparents in your own life, getting through this?
My grandfather was Catholic. My grandmother was Protestant.
Wow.
But they raised us all in the Catholic Church. And so he brought us to church. He made sure we all went and did the sacraments. Now, another funny story about my grandmother that's not in this book, which you'll appreciate. So a friend and I, we traveled to Italy, and I went to the Vatican, and I bought these, these rosaries, these wooden rosaries that were blessed by the Pope, and I brought them home to my grandmother. And she was reading her trashy, romance novel, and she said, "Oh, thanks, Jess." She was like, "But you know, I'm not Catholic, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I know. You're Protestant." She goes, "Okay." She goes, "You know what? When I die, put them in my hands. That way, when all my friends come through, they'll be like, wasn't she Protestant?"
She's hedging
that is what we did.
Hedging her bets, Jarrett.
Yeah.
She's hedging her bets. Now, you don't meet your father until you're 17.
I'm 17. Yeah.
He sends you notes. He sends you a letter. Finally, sends you a picture of his sibling.
He sent me a letter when I was 16 and a half. And then I took some time before I wrote him back. And I wrote him back because I thought to myself, at that point, I want nothing to do with this guy, but he might have had other kids. And I'll never know if I have siblings out there unless I swallow my pride
and engage.
And engage.
Yeah. And you did.
And I did.
And you have a relationship
and
now.
he's still in my life now, as are my brother and sister.
Wow.
Yeah.
You wrote a piece in the Washington Post recently, and you wrestled with coming from Lunch Lady and the amazing, fun, whimsical, silly books you've written that my children and others adore. Now you're getting into subject matter that is more real, more gritty, and you wrestled with what's appropriate for kids at different ages. And you discussed this book, Hey Kiddo, with your own daughter.
Yes.
She's what?
She's 9. Almost 10.
And her reaction. There's a particular story in the book you tell of your mother who was involved, one of her boyfriends was involved in a murder.
Yes.
She disposes of the murder weapon.
Yes.
And you all had this discussion. What did your daughter say in reaction?
And as you can imagine, a lot of things that I need to approach with my kids about their family history. So I want to make sure we had that conversation before the world read about it in the book. And I think as parents too, we're nervous to talk to our kids about difficult things. And I think those nerves, we have to realize that's on us because our kids are able to handle these things and these truths, these complicated, difficult truths. And so she was very quick to point out that, maybe she helped him because she was nervous if he was a violent man. He would have hurt her. Maybe he would have hurt you as a baby. So she took that news and instead of saying, "Oh,
what a terrible
person," well, let's think about what she was going through. Let's think about
how scared she
was in that moment. And that's something that I hadn't even thought of.
The empathy of children.
The empathy of children is
They are
profound.
inherently empathetic.
And we just need to give them credit for that. And it's interesting, you talk about this difficult subjects, and I did write that Washington Post op-ed about when do we give kids these sort of information. So I was at a book signing recently, and there was a mother there with an 8-year-old. And in my internal monologue here, I thought, oh gosh, does she think this is the Lunch Lady show or Jedi Academy And I thought, you know what? I don't say anything. Let them. They'll get it.
Right.
There's a slide with this book. If they need to leave, they'll leave.
Right.
And at the book signing after the presentation, that mother told me that that girl's 12-year-old brother died of an overdose.
Oh boy.
So we have these difficult things that we're worried about telling kids, but meanwhile, these kids are living the difficult truth.
Yeah, I mean, I read, it might have been in your article, 8.7 million children, 17 and under, are living in
some
homes,
sort of addiction.
Yeah, where there's some sort of addiction there at play. That's a huge number. And you see it, don't you see it in the school visits, though?
Yes.
In between, they'll come and tell you, this reminded me, even when you're doing whimsical work, they come up to me and say, that demon you talk about in the book, when Will was fighting that, I felt like I was fighting my dad when he's on drugs. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
You don't realize the pain that's in many of these classrooms that these children are carrying with them. What has been the reaction to this, Jarrett, as kids read it and absorb it? What are they telling you?
I'm hearing stories of kids saying, I thought I was the only one. I was just at a book signing here in D.C., and a young student, 14, 15 years old, gave me a fist bump and said, I'm a part of the No Dads Club, too.
Oh.
And it's, books can be mirrors and windows. So we see ourselves reflected, or we can see into the lives of others. And I'm grateful that that's what this book is doing for people.
Your mother died in March of 2017.
She did.
You shared with her, though, that you were working on this.
Yes.
Tell me what the last meeting with her was like.
It was in a cemetery.
Do you see? Full circle here.
It was full circle. So about a year after she passed, her eldest brother died, and the last time I saw her was at his burial. Now, I had suspected that my mother was using again. She was getting arrested again. You know, for some time, the only way I could keep track of her was to look up her last name on the court records. So our last interaction was, she said, I love you, and I always will. And I said, I love you, and I always will. And I was getting to the point where I thought, okay, now that I have some stuff to share about this book, I need to talk to her to see what her comfort level is on what I'm sharing, because this is her life as well. You know, and then, you know, she died, and she left me with her stories. You know, she didn't leave me with any kind of physical material, and I don't need any of that. The love she gave me is still carries me to this day. I'm so appreciative for that love. Her life story, my grandparents' life story, that she always hoped that her story might be able to help other people suffering from addiction. You know, and when she died, of a heroin overdose, that really taught me, like, wow, she could not help herself. You know,
God bless her. Yeah, no, it's an empathetic portrait of her. It's a true portrait of the effect this addiction has on not only the child, but everyone around that child. Yeah. And I think for children who are going through this, or kids who might be contemplating or entering the possibility of drug use, which, let's admit, it's in schools and on streets all over this country.
And it starts young.
It's a cautionary tale. She started at what, 13?
13.
Yeah.
And that's where some people would say, well, you know, this book says 12 and up, but I would probably wait until 14.
15 or 18.
And I said, well, my mother started using when she was 13.
No, it's a timely age, and this book is for 12 and up. But given the younger and younger age of children addicted that I see today, and friends of mine on police forces will tell you, I think it's an important book for 12 and up. It's not only an engaging, fun tale and a true one, but because there are light moments here and a lot of and true fun moments as well. Give me a sense of the importance of silly books, and that is what you made your name doing. It's why people love you. Platypus Police Force, The Lunch Lady, Jedi Academy. What is the importance of silly books in the lives of children and in their parents?
Well, silly books offers something high interest for the kid to read. Silly books offers a reprieve, a possible escape portal. Right. You know, I had kids coming up to me talking about, you know, the Lunch Lady books made them want to read. Now, this is, all I wanted to do was draw a lunch lady fighting off robots with fish stick nunchucks and you know, using food words as expletives, right? And so many people have said to me, these books got their kids reading, but also some people would say, you know, my kid was dealing with trauma. I left an abusive relationship. My kid started really slipping. She couldn't latch onto anything, but she had these lunch lady books. And I think back to my childhood. Yeah. Well, I read Garfield and, you know, Calvin and Hobbes and Snoopy and all of these comic strips. Yeah. I'd go to the comic book store once a month to look for the latest Batman or Spider-Man or X-Men. And those were my lifeboats. It was my life jackets.
Lifelines,
you know? Yeah.
What do you think it is about children in difficult circumstances and the power of literature? My friend Dean Koontz, of course, best-selling author, his childhood, books were his refuge. He had an abusive father. And the books became his salvation and his life's work. Is there something there where kids in difficult situations almost need this kind of imaginative life craft that then they take into their adulthood?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I just happen to go into a creative endeavor. Right. No matter what you do as an adult, silly books are important. You know, no matter what your line of work is going to be, because reading is important, because reading will develop empathy. Reading will help you have a deeper understanding of yourself.
And joy. The importance of joy, which we are losing not only in society, but for our kids too. Yes. It's important to give them a sense of joy. There are a few books I read, particularly graphic novels. I'm not a big graphic novel guy. I loved comic books when I was younger. I'm not a big graphic novel guy. This one is so moving and beautiful. Why the orange? We didn't ask. Why the gray and rust palette throughout the book, which is important?
It is important. So I wanted it to be limited color because I didn't like graphic memoirs are very popular in the middle grade market, which is like 7 to 11-year-olds. And I wanted to go limited palette to signal that this was for older readers. It's the grayscales because I mentioned earlier, life is varying shades of gray. And it's that orange. So my grandfather always would rock a pocket square. So he'd always, when he was getting dressed up, he'd always put in a pocket square.
An orange one?
Orange or red.
Wow.
And he'd always put in a pop of color. Pop of color.
Pop of color.
And so when he died, and we were donating his clothes to charity, I couldn't get myself to donate these pocket squares because they were so him. My daughter Zoe, who was then 1.5, toddled over, took this silk pocket square, put it to her cheek, and said, "Mine," and it became her security blanket. And she slept with it every night since then. She'll be 10 in December.
Wow.
So that orange is that very color orange.
Amazing. No, there's so many beautiful touches. The pineapple wallpaper, so much here that's evocative and powerful. When I first read it, I said, wow. You know, you can feel the authenticity.
You almost smell the cigarette smoke.
Yeah, almost smell the cigarette. And I smell the JB.
Or the aftershave or the shell.
It's there. It's there in the ether. Okay, for the story-oriented questions, your favorite children's book and why?
The Mouse and the Motorcycle by Beverly Cleary. All-time favorite. I read that book over and over when I was a kid. I had a pet hamster, you'll meet him if you read the book.
You do meet him in the book.
He did not. I could not get him to ride a bicycle, but I'd get him to walk on a leash.
Why did you love it so much, do you think?
I just identified with the character. You know, it was a realistic story with this moment of magic with the boy who could communicate with that little rodent.
Your least favorite book or children's book, can be any book.
Can I say my least favorite children's book author?
Yes.
Okay, Bob Shea.
Oh boy.
Bob Shea. You know that Bob Shea. He has all these books like Unicorn Thinks He's Pretty Great.
Yes.
Dinosaur versus Bedtime.
Yes.
I mean, these books are really funny, and they're colorful.
But he's your least favorite.
My least
They're
favorite.
friends. We'll move on. He's too nice to say who is truly least favorite, but I'm going to squeeze it out of him before he leaves.
But I'm happy to make fun of Bob Shea.
Okay. The story that helped you on your path and the lesson you learned from it. Story-oriented is all about my sense that stories orient us in the world. They teach us where we fit into it, how we fit into it. What was the story that did that for you?
Okay, 7th grade.
Okay.
September of 7th grade. I'm given a book to read. It's Anne of Green Gables.
Anne of Green Gables?
Now, I'm thinking, I'm going to hate this. Like, it's historical fiction.
Girls in Calico.
Yeah, there's, I thought, like, she doesn't have superpowers.
Yep.
And I think, in general, sometimes, not all the time, but boys can be afraid to read a book with a girl on the cover.
Right.
And sometimes adults are perpetuating that by saying, oh, that's a girl book, that's a boy book.
Right.
So I read this book begrudgingly and then realized I had so much in common with Anne. She was an orphan who came to live with his family. She was hyperactive. She was always kind of messing up. She was funny. And so I guess for me, I took from that despite where she came from, she was able to go on to have a good life because then I read every book in that series. There were about 8 or 9 of them.
Wow.
Yeah, the book goes on, and the series goes on until there's Anne of Green Gables and Anne of Avonlea, and eventually it's about her grandkids.
Wow.
And so I guess for me, I didn't
with
realize.
A walker. Yeah.
And with a walker. Yeah.
That was my favorite.
And if the Green Gables home. Yeah.
Why not? Yeah. Why not? I love that. That was your favorite book.
Yeah.
Give me a sense of where you write and why.
Okay. So when I have a studio at home, the majority of Hey Kiddo was done at a studio outside of my home, though, because I wanted to exercise these demons outside of my home and try to keep them separate as much as I could. I go back and forth on working at home or working outside of the home. The thing about deadlines, though, is that sometimes you have to wake up very early or stay up very late.
Yeah. So the home is the only option.
The thing about children is that they can be very distracting too. But I got to say though, I'm grateful for those distractions because I realize that the time with them being small is very finite.
It is. You bet. Tell me where do your best ideas come from? The whimsical, the fun ones.
I suppose when I go back and reconnect with whoever I was at that age. So this book was written from that 17-year-old perspective of the 17-year-old me. I had to reconnect with that person. The Lunch Lady books, the tone of the Lunch Lady books.
Where did the Lunch Lady come from?
Well, I ran into my old lunch lady as an adult. She told me about her grandkids. But it wasn't until, and I thought, if you have grandkids, you live at home, you don't live at the school, like, what are you hiding? And so I found these comics I wrote as a 5th grader. And I modeled the Lunch Lady books after those comics. I recreated the kind of style of language, the style of artwork I was making. And so also just observing the goofiness of children, my own children, or I'm at schools.
Are you a gardener or an architect, George M. Martin has those two. He says there are two types of writers, gardeners or architects. I tend to think we're somewhere in between. But
I think a little bit of both, you know, because ideas percolate for years. But then when it's ready and I can really focus on it, I mean, I have ideas in my sketchbooks. They might last 10 years or they might last 10 weeks, but when the story's ready, it's ready.
Yeah, and you can't force that.
And I can't force when it's ready, and then that's when the building goes up.
If you could write anything else, what would it be?
I'd say a biography about Bob Shea. The life of Bob Shea, where it went wrong for him.
And you know what Bob Shea told me? He wants to write your biography. You already did it.
And that's the problem with Bob Shea. He's always doing something just 2 minutes too late.
Jarrett, congratulations. Thank you for
Raymond.
being here. Love the book. Hey Kiddo, it's in bookstores everywhere.
Thank you.